Okay, may I start?
Please.
Okay. Just to make the debate really clean, what is going on in the round? When one undergoes an embryo transfer, they undergo a procedure known as an IVF. In this procedure, an egg is removed from the woman and fertilized outside of her body, then put back into her body. This motion suggests that in that process, when another woman was also getting an IVF, the doctors mixed up the two embryos. So now woman A has woman B's embryo. This motion is about whether woman A has an ownership claim over woman B's embryo, given it was given to woman A. On OG, we say screw the lottery of birth, it doesn't. 3 arguments. 1, individuals do not own their genetic material innately. There are a series of reasons why this is true. The relevant premise to establish for this argument is that how you get your genetic material is completely arbitrary. You don't decide who your parents are, what the context of getting access to this genetic material even is. And providing genetic material doesn't mean you're entitled to your own genetic material. Critically, morally, we ought to base ownership not based on things that arbitrarily happen for you to possess. The key line we need to point out is that moral ownership cannot be derived from complete randomness. And there are 2 reasons for this. There is no such thing as morality without any conception of reason. Keep in mind, when you base ownership on arbitrariness, there is no degree of reason involved in as much as your genetic material is purely random. But secondly, arbitrariness increases the degree of unfairness that tends to exist. Some people get better genetic material than others. This is equivalent to discriminating against someone based on immutable characteristics they have in the first place, aligning with their ideas that the gender gap, for example, is quite immoral. The plausible response they might have to this is, but why make things more arbitrary? 1, we're going to explain in our case why this ownership claim specifically for woman A is morally significant. But secondly, the key thing to point out is that morality is aspirational. Even if we have a starting point that is arbitrary, that is not a reason not to strive toward a less arbitrary world, even if both sides of this debate are arbitrary. The second thing to point out is that your genetic material is no longer part of your body. So people have self-ownership, but not of bodily parts that are detached from them and hence not dependent on their own bodies to survive. The reason for this is that a body part of yours is yours because it affects you and not in an indirect third order kind of way. For instance, if a piece of hair falls off of my head and falls onto the ground, I no longer have an ownership claim over that piece of hair in as much as it isn't morally salient in any kind of way. Critically, what matters for bodily autonomy is the presence in your body, not where its origin is from. And a useful thought experiment to note here, for example, is that a man does not have the ability to make decisions about an abortion, even though his sperm was involved in the process, because the fetus's location is in the woman's body. The third thing to point out is that even if you initially owned your genetic material, you were fully aware of the risks involved in this process, and you gave up your ownership of it by consenting to the IVF process. Keep in mind, you likely had the knowledge of the risks of an error in medical procedure. Now, the structural reason that doctors have strong incentives to advise parents on this through things like screenings and making parents aware of these risks is because obviously they want to avoid liability and understand that it's quite easy for these mistakes to happen in the first place. So on a balance of probabilities, it is likely that you were made aware of these risks. The other thing that's worth noting under this argument is that people don't usually plan the genetics of their child while having a child with a partner. They're not like, this other person I'm having a baby with is smart, except in relatively narrow cases. And even in those narrow cases, like where you paid for someone's sperm, having access to economic privilege that allows you to pay for this sperm and the sperm banks you can access are entirely out of your control. This does 2 main things to the debate. 1, it beats any op argument about why, well, losing your embryo is arbitrary, since you are well aware of the risks in the lead up, but it secondarily explains why any op ownership claim is quite weak. Secondly, carrying an embryo directly entails moral ownership of it. Now, in this round, op is probably going to give competing analysis for why woman B has a ownership claim over woman A's embryo. So obviously there are competing obligations that exist in their best case. Now I'm going to explain in this argument why woman A's ownership is more morally significant than woman B's ownership. So a number of reasons that woman A has an ownership claim. The first is that the embryo is entirely dependent on woman A, which generates reciprocity. And our moral intuitions align with this idea. Like if your family members care for you, you ought to care for them because it feeds on your nutrition, your decisions, and causes specific strains on your body. For instance, the ability for you to lose teeth, to experience postpartum depression later down the line. But the second thing to point out is that the embryo is now a part of your body. And in as much as people are entitled to ownership of things that were proximately in them and part of their systems, that is more morally significant. For example, as I mentioned earlier, if a piece of hair falls off of your head, you probably have a relatively weak ownership claim over that, but I do have an ownership claim over my beating heart. Thirdly, the end outcome of the embryo is influenced by your decisions while pregnant. For instance, whether or not you drank while someone else did. So given competing obligations, why is the one that we identify more morally significant? The first reason is that our obligation involves a greater degree of free will and therefore is less arbitrary. So maybe you arbitrarily got the wrong embryo, but there is less arbitrariness involved in the direct care that you are providing for your child, because at every point you made decisions to ensure that that child was appropriately cared for. But secondarily, it's about who endures more of a loss. Yes, OO is right. There may be some degree of an emotional loss, but keep in mind that is counterbalanced by the fact that woman B, by the logic of this motion, also has an ownership claim over woman A's initial embryo. So the degree of cost that happens on both of their bodies is much greater if you accept that the motion is correct. The third argument I want to make is why this is broadly better for the health of the child. Now, this argument presupposes that even if the relevant metric in the round is consequentialism, this is harmful to the child. Now, the key thing to point out is that belief in non-ownership creates a moral hazard that affects the child's rights and damages the parent-child relationship. And there are a number of reasons this is a likely outcome. The first reason is that when you feel a specific ownership claim over the embryo, it is easier to find motivation within yourself during the pregnancy, like not drinking or smoking when you are really tempted to do so. And the structural reason for this is that belief in non-ownership means that they aren't your child in the first place. So there's less of an impetus to care for the child. But secondly, there are many social narratives surrounding the idea that you specifically are the one who should care for the child. For example, lots of stigma surrounding the idea that individuals who undergo IVFs or couples who are adopted are relatively stigmatized. And just to note, this does not knife the second argument that you still have an ownership claim, because even if you don't make directly intentful decisions to care for your newfound embryo, you are still intrinsically putting labor into it in as much as it creates an emotional strain on your body and is using your nutrition, for example. And obviously, the child is also a relevant moral unit in the round in as much as they are least able to consent into this situation in the first place.
I'd like to thank the speaker for the fine speech, and I'd like to remind people, as per the World's manual, to please accept and offer POIs during the speeches. They're very important for engagement. But with that, I'd now like to invite the LO.
Cool. I'm going to assume I'm audible and visible. Let me know if I'm not. POIs in the chat. If I don't take one, please interrupt me. This is not a debate about what happens to the embryo when it becomes a baby and then becomes a child, or what actions ought to be taken on either side based on who it belongs to. It's just an assessment of, in a world where there is an embryo that either belongs to couple A or couple B, is it more principally justified to claim that it is couple B, whose genetic material it was created from? I think there are a couple of reasons, other than just the simple extension of how this debate is phrased and the burden it puts on either teams, that I think that there's not enough information to argue about outcomes here. The first is, we do not have reason to believe that either couple knows of this mix-up. There's a couple of reasons we don't know this. It just doesn't say it in the info slide. All it says is that the couple whose genetic material it is has been located. We do not know that this is because the couples were informed of this mess up. We do not know that they have been informed of this. We don't know that the couple whose genetic material it is knows about this either. The second thing is, we don't know how these couples individually feel about this situation. For instance, the couple who is currently pregnant might just be very, very happy and not care about the fact that this genetic material is not theirs. They might just want a baby and be fine with that. The reason this is important is I think it frames out a lot of the second argument that hinges on outcomes to this embryo depending on who we think it belongs to. I don't think that's part of the debate. It's just about ownership. Two chunks of responses to OG. The first thing I want to respond to is the idea that individuals do not own their genetic material. I think there's two problems here. The first is, just because you do not have a say in how you get genetic material, i.e. you get it arbitrarily because you were born to certain sets of parents with certain genetics, does not mean that at the point at which it is given to you, it does not belong to you. This is why we recognize that your teeth belong to you, even if it was arbitrarily given to you because your parents had good genetics and they had good teeth, it's still your teeth. The second thing is, this is also why we actively require individuals to consent to do things like donate blood, to donate their hair, to donate their organs after they die. Because even if those things were arbitrarily given to them, and it is sheer luck that you have a blood group that could be donated to multiple people, it is still your blood, and therefore you still have ownership over it, where it goes, and how it is allocated or taken from you. The second thing I want to respond to is the idea that if a body part no longer impacts your well-being, or your genetic material is no longer critical to your functioning, that you no longer have ownership claims over this. Here's the problem. Take their own example. They say a man does not have a say in what a woman does when considering things like abortion or reproductive rights. This is true, but the reasoning for this is not because of the genetic material no longer being associated with them. It's because we recognize that the fact that it is their genetic material does not override the rights that the woman exercises over her body and her genetic material. I actually think this is quite an unstrategic example for OG, because I think in this scenario, in the status quo, we still require parents to do things like pay alimony, or believe that in some instance, obviously depending on the context and circumstances, absent parents should do things like provide for the child, because it is their actions and genetic material that has caused the existence of that child. So I don't think their case stands on those two things. Two arguments from OO. The first thing I want to argue is that it does not belong to the woman that is currently pregnant, because this woman has not made a conscious effort to create that embryo, and that is extremely important. There's a couple of things that the biological parents of this genetic material or of this embryo have done that this parent has not done for this embryo. First, they haven't taken several series of medicines and injections and cycles of IVF that are extremely expensive and require you to put your body through enormous amounts of pain and pressure and all of those things. They have not gone to doctor's appointments or eaten certain foods or shell out certain amounts of money for this particular outcome. They haven't gone to things like doing relationship counseling or potentially doing things like treatments that require them to change their diets and all of that. Obviously, the response we're going to get from Gov is to say, but presumably, if the other set of parents are also trying to get a similar outcome, they are also doing similar things. The difference is, the parents that we're talking about, whose genetic material it is, did all of these things to have access to a child that is of their genetic material. That is why them doing these actions means they have ownership over the outcome of these actions, which is the creation of an embryo that has their genetic material. The second reason that they still have ownership is they haven't actively done things to mandate foregoing ownership. Obviously, they did not consent to this mix-up happening in how the embryo was transferred to the wrong set of parents, and they likely would not have been okay with the same thing happening to them, or they likely would not have been okay with knowing that this would happen. The second thing is, they haven't done anything which in status quo mandates the removal of this type of ownership. They haven't done things to show that they are unfit to provide for this embryo. In fact, if you look at all of the analysis of the likely things that parents go through or couples go through when they're trying to do things like IVF, they've done the opposite. They haven't done things to harm the health of the embryo. They haven't withheld things like certain treatments or foods that would benefit the embryo. The second argument that I'm going to make in this debate is that the reason the embryo exists in the first place is because of the people that provided that genetic material. Because they are a prerequisite for the existence of this embryo, they have primary ownership. Note that this is important because you can still recognize that other people have contributed to this embryo being created or to this baby growing, but recognize that primary ownership belongs to the individuals whose genetic material was a prerequisite for its existence. I'll take a POI from closing before I impact this.
Yeah. Should the genetic parents have the right to kidnap the child at birth?
That's not what the debate is about. The example of this is when farmers do things like farm apples, they've put in the work to create an environment that's going to cultivate those apples. They've done the physical labor to create those apples. The product of these apples belongs to the farmer until and unless that farmer independently chooses to sell those apples, give them away, or do anything else. Let me be very clear, and this kind of goes into what CG was hinting at. The reason this is very different to things like adoption is because even if the kids that are given up for adoption belong genetically or have the genetic material of other people, those people often do explicit things or intentionally give up that child, or the parents that adopt that child do several things to intentionally result in that outcome or result in that ownership. They do things like go through relationship counseling, go through security checks, go through building an environment in their home or finding a school that this child can go through and be happy in, that the set of parents that now carry the child have not done. The reason this is important is the actions that constitute the ownership of an embryo are not just about what happens after the fertilized egg gets put in the womb of the woman. It's the series of things that the genetic material parents have done to make sure that it is possible for that egg to get fertilized in the first place and create that embryo. For all those reasons, oppose.
I'd like to thank the speaker for that fine speech. I'd now like to invite the DPM.
Can you hear me? POIs in the chat exclusively. I will probably take 2. Matt, could I ask that you turn your video on just so you're looking at me? I'm not happy with speaking just to a blank screen. Thank you so much. I find opening opposition's picture of parenting weird because apparently before going through an IVF process, you change your diet, you go through immense physical labor, you plan about raising a child, and you change your body in order to account for the genetic material that your child will have in the future. But once you are pregnant, all that stops. Most parents do not have the time or energy to extensively plan IVF processes to the point where they literally change largely unchangeable genetic material before they go through with the process. But the vast majority of parents, the vast majority of them, going through pregnancy does involve massive labor, massive degrees of planning, and massive changes to their body. That was an uncomparative case that should therefore lose. I want to first talk about the moral entitlement to ownership and then engage with the claims I think are very topical about the future child, because you can't wave a wand and assume that's not the topic. First, on the moral entitlement to ownership. Both sides agree that people have self-ownership, and both sides implicate self-ownership. That is, this genetic material was in someone's body and was in that body for a while, and planning was involved prior to the process of fertilization, while it's later in the body of the woman who carries the child to term. Therefore, what are the deadlock breakers here that mean people have greater self-ownership on our side? The first reason for this is because of the involvement or the extent of free will involved in this process, because there's some arbitrariness on both sides, but there's more free will involved on our side. Opposition's claim is cycles of IVF are enormously expensive. People go through doctor's appointments. People eat certain foods in planning for what their child will be like in the future. But this is entirely symmetric because during pregnancy, you go through relationship counseling. You change what your diet is during pregnancy, and you plan for the outcome of your child afterward. For example, whether you make the decision about whether to drink when you're pregnant has massive effects on your child. So we have to do some weighing. Which of these two decisions, the decisions you make during pregnancy or the decisions you make while trying to influence your genetic material, are more morally significant? There are 3 structural reasons why the decisions you make during pregnancy are more significant. Reason 1, because less can be changed about your genetic material than about your fetus once you are pregnant. That is, DNA structures are largely unchangeable throughout people's lives. If they were changeable, people would go through genetic mutations as they, for example, aged. And we know this does not happen because it doesn't make evolutionary sense, because otherwise people's bodies would change radically during their lives. This is simply a fact of common sense. The fact that you know less can be changed means you make fewer decisions to plan in advance for what your genetic material is like compared to when you're pregnant, because we all know about fetal alcohol syndrome. Use your common sense. We all know people's decisions while they are pregnant affects what nutrition your fetus gets, affects what your child is like afterward. Second, because of time. parents invest a lot more time when their child is proximate. Things like planning for a school cannot happen before you've gone through with IVF because you don't know if you will have a child at the end of it in the first place. And this uncertainty is crippling for you to overcommit to previous decisions. However, when you're pregnant, that's when it feels like an imminent decision that you have to make, which is when you do a lot of the relationship counseling and planning. Third, because this feels more like a direct effect, and critically, most parents do not have the time or resources to do extensive planning, even if they were able to afford IVF. If anything, IVF is a big hit to your budget, and you do not have the capacity to take time off work and think about what you do prior to when you're pregnant compared to when you're actually pregnant. The second deadlock breaker is reciprocity. That is, if you put more effort, using their apples analogy, you are more entitled to this ownership. Their claim is you do physical labor during IVF. I'm sorry, your labor is substantially harder when you literally go through labor, i.e. are pregnant. Why is this true? First, because there is less chance to avoid the pain. Most people do not like the pain associated with having a child, a radical change to their diets that causes vomiting, the trauma of feeling pain every time, the risk of a miscarriage that keeps you up at night. These are deeply traumatic things that people want to avoid. Here's the critical margin. When you are planning for IVF, even if you care a lot about the future child that you have, you are able to make the decision to avoid it. And when you have the impulse to avoid pain, you will. But when you go through pregnancy, you cannot make that decision because pregnancy in and of itself is massively pain and labor inducing for your body. Before I go further, I'll take POIs. First from closing.
So I just want to clarify, if my organs are stolen from me, you would still call that bad? Or if like I gave the embryo to the hospital, I would still own that, right? Like you agree that you can keep something inside me or that I put into the hospital, right?
I guess. Well, I mean, I'll talk about the point about ownership later in my speech. Opening?
If it is such a big hit to your budget, you probably care about making it very, very likely you're successful in getting a fertilizable egg and shit like that, which is why you make it very likely that you are healthy.
You care equally about making it likely that you are healthy when you are pregnant with a kid, except it feels a lot more imminent and it is less cost imposing on you. The third point we make is about the arbitrariness of genetic material. Here I want to address opposition's claims. They say, first, your teeth belong to you. Your teeth belong to you because they are attached to you currently. We have no intuition that a fallen tooth that fell arbitrarily belongs to you. They say you need to consent to donate blood. But the reason why is donating blood has risks and implications to your body. In the presence of arbitrariness, there is a reason why we do not think blood that is already outside your body after something like injury necessarily belongs to you. But here's the critical point. Even if you have some ownership claim to a body part that is removed from your body, the key point is there is less of an ownership claim than things that happen to you while you go through the process of pregnancy itself. And here's the structural reason for this. And this is where the abortion analogy comes from. They themselves say the man's rights doesn't override the women's rights. The reason it doesn't is not because the woman owns genetic material, but instead because when the fetus is in your body, it is a part of you as a person, even if it was historically the part of someone else. So after a blood donation happens, the new blood belongs to you. In fact, even in an unjust situation where blood was stolen from someone and then donated to you, once it is inside your body, you have more of a moral claim because it is much more directly proximate to you. But finally, I want to talk to you about why this is better for kids and their families. They say it's not a debate about what happens to the embryo, but presumably morality has to exist in the real world. Moral ownership matters insofar as it exists in the real world, and we consider the rights of things like kids in this process all the time. Here is what Mac told you. Parents are not bad people, but pregnancy is a difficult time. You face a lot of exertions, stresses, and pressures. You're often on the verge of doing things like drinking. Now, some parents will drink on both sides. Some parents will be sufficiently moral and not drink. But for a lot of parents, they will be thinking about the future. What will prevent them from having that glass of wine when they are really stressed is thinking about what happens to the kid after the kid is born. But if that kid doesn't end up with them, then they do not make this decision which harms the child's future. For these reasons, propose.
I'd like to thank the speaker for the fine speech. I'd now like to invite the DLO.
Can everyone hear me?
Yep.
All right, I'll take a POI from closing government. What a lovely debate. All right. I'm going to start in 3, 2, 1. I hate philosophy debates, so it's a bit ironic that the first thing I'm going to do is frame out the non-philosophical aspects of this debate. Why is this debate not about the practical outcomes? First reason, because Tejas spends 22 seconds on this argument, which probably implies it is not very important. But beyond that, listen to the phrasing of the motion. This is not a this house would tell the parent. This is not a this house would haba and do whatever the fuck. This is a this house believes that the embryo belongs motion. And the reason why this matters is because nothing in the motion indicates that there's going to be subsequent actions taken once this declarative statement happens. And this is important because if opening government really wants to run this argument, massive analytical gap. I do not know why anything's going to happen. That is why they are out. But beyond that, this is quite important just for the reason that oftentimes people do things that is not the truth. So like if the motion is this house believes that the sky is blue and I think the sky is red, like it doesn't matter. The debate on whether or not the sky is blue still exists, and that doesn't affect me on a day-to-day. I'm going to talk about two things. Number one, the stuff on ownership and whether or not if it comes out of you, it equates as ownership. And then second of all, the metric Keerthana gives and the wholly lack of response that Tejas has on this front. First of all, let's talk about the opening government argument because their argument's a bit ridiculous. Their argument is that once something exits your body, it is no longer yours. I'm going to give you a fun experiment. I take a shit in the middle of Vietnam because I went to Vietnam 2 weeks ago. Once I leave Vietnam, that shit is still mine. I'm still prosecuted for that shit being there as public indecency. But the reason why this matters as well is because no one else claimed that shit or actively tried to contest whether or not that shit was mine. And the reason why this matters in this debate, no thank you, Mark, is because this debate was very clear from the info slide. No one claimed ownership of that baby or tried to contest whether or not the ownership existed in the first instance. Everyone is just realizing this happened for the first time. And the reason as to why it is unlikely that any claim of ownership will happen is precisely for the reasons that Keerthana gives. Oftentimes, it is quite important that you have genetic claim over your specific baby because society glorifies things, for example, like biological connections. Oftentimes in media, we are told that this is important, but also you feel more affinity towards your biological baby. And as a result of that, there's a technology to like do the switcheroo in the first instance. These parents probably want to switcheroo back necessarily in the hypothetical, which is also why the contestation is unlikely going to happen. No, thank you. What was their argument? Their argument was that genetic material necessarily is arbitrary, and as a result of that, everything else is also arbitrary. The first observation I want to make is that this is a value-neutral claim because I do not think their side of the house necessarily proves why arbitrariness changes for the better or for worse. But this is important as well because their metric, if you listen very carefully, is that reciprocity is higher because you spend more time with that baby when that baby is inside parent A. So if I can flip this argument and explain why parent B actually spent far more time in the construction and the development of that baby, then this flips the opening government principle. And this is quite important because this also disproves their claim because at best they explain why genetic material as an outcome is arbitrary, but not necessarily why the process in which you arrive at that outcome is also arbitrary. And here's the way up here. On average, a pregnancy is about 9 months, I think. Maybe I'm wrong. And the reason why this is significant is because you need to ask yourself the question of when is this test likely going to have happened? Because if opening government is correct, that this happens like at month 8, then maybe it is true that the parent A has spent substantially more time and contributed to that baby. But we told you this was unlikely from leader of opposition. The first reason is, if it is the case that IVF is such a massive sunk cost, there's active incentive for everyone who's investing in IVF to do frequent checkups, etc. But also because oftentimes it is seen as a very expensive and very polished business, the firms also has an incentive to get the parent to do constant checkups because if they fuck up, it looks bad on them as well. Which means the likely instance in which this test has happened is at the beginning of pregnancy, maybe not week 1, but likely in the first 3 months. And the reason why this therefore matters in weigh up is because weigh this up against all of the argument Keerthana gives you about the active contribution parent B has made to that baby. Number 1, the emotional duress of going through and deciding whether or not you want to have a pregnancy in the first place. This is longer than 3 months and even 9 months because oftentimes because of misogyny, patriarchy, norms that glorify family as a nuclear unit, all of these sorts of things, you start thinking about it the moment you can speak from age 5. This is why my mother asked me when I got my first girlfriend at age 12 when I was going to have my first grandkid, and it is super pressurizing. Maybe it is because I'm Asian, but the point is coercive social trends make people think about this from an early age. Therefore, you start working towards that baby quite early on. In terms of magnitude, this therefore beats the 3 to 9 months that exist on opening government. But second of all, there are active changes to your lifestyle that you have to make. And this is quite important because most people who do IVF assume they're fertile first because Oftentimes you don't know if you're infertile or not, and you try having sex first and try to get pregnant, and then, oh shit, you realize you cannot get pregnant, and then you do this test, which matters because all of the lifestyle choices that Keerthana talks about compounds and does not happen in a split second, especially because opening government says this is very expensive, which means you think about it a lot, you test it a lot. That is why there's an active harm. The reason why this therefore matters is twofold. The first fold is if the metric opening government want to use this in this debate is on the extent of effort, then that effort is far higher on our side of the house, both because this test likely happens very early in the pregnancy, which means a lot of the stuff that Tejas talks about, like taking care of the baby, etc., is something that you've only done for a little bit. But second of all, you also do this in the lead up to the baby, changing your home, changing how you dress, changing your lifestyle, changing how you talk to your parents. This is why that contribution metric is significant. And if opening government is correct that this metric is the tipping point in this debate, then we prove why contribution is that higher. But second of all, their claim here was that, well, the baby is entirely dependent on parent A now. This is bullshit and not true. Number one, because if you had bad sperm going into that baby, then the baby would have died anyways. But also surely the lead up to that IVF, the payment of that IMF or IVF are all things that parent B did. And to that extent, insofar as it is not entirely dependent on parent A, that is why parent A does not have exclusive ownership. Closing government.
Yeah, suppose A wants to get an abortion. Should B be able to veto the operation?
Dude, this is not fucking part of the debate. You go tell me, Mark. You're very smart. Great. What is the metric of ownership that we told you? The first thing we told you is that this is equivalent to theft, because the way ownership works is unless it is forfeited or claimed by someone else, that ownership ought still exist. Which is why if my shit is still in Vietnam and no one has claimed it, it is still my shit. But if Shaurya claims it, then it becomes Shaurya shit. Here's why this becomes theft. Number one, because neither parents recognize that this thing has happened in the first instance, which means no one was cognizant of the fact that the switch has happened. So logically speaking, ownership still exists with the original individual insofar as no one has recognized it. But second of all, insofar as this is true, no one has forfeited that right to ownership. And that is why necessarily that still is something that exists. The only response opening government gives is, well, no, there is a risk that when you do IVF, this thing exists. And as a result of that, you kind of forfeit your consent. First response, this risk is oftentimes super small, both because of the rise of technology, but these firms have an incentive to package the risk as small because otherwise no one will do IVF. So the parent oftentimes is unaware or uninformed of that risk. And as a result of that, this metric doesn't work. But second of all, even if you buy that, this is crazy logic. This is like saying, if a school has a small chance of exploding when I send my kid there, I no longer have ownership of my kid. This is outlandish. This is why opening opposition wins this debate.
I'd like to thank the speaker for the fine speech. I'd now like to invite the MG.
Right. Should be audible and visible. Please
Yep.
give POIs in the Zoom chat. Right. Couple of things from closing government in this round. Firstly, what does it mean for something to belong with you? Dealing with, I think, quite an unreasonable interpretation coming from OO. Secondly, we're going to explain bodily autonomy beyond what, like, one line that we get at PM and why this is the most important principle in this round. And finally, we're going to talk about the nature of rights as instrumental and why giving this right or belonging to opposition would be just really bad consequentially and clearly wrong. Starting with what it actually means for something to belong to you. I would propose that at closing government, the only reasonable interpretation of what it means for something to belong with you is that you can do what you want to do with it, providing you're not like breaking other laws and constraints within society. If a house belongs to me, I can paint it, I can decide who lives there, I can expand it, I can decide to demolish it. If a child is my child, then I get to decide how they are raised, how they're schooled, the things they eat, how I'm going to teach them, and so on. The same applies to a fetus. If it belongs to me, then I'm able to decide whether to keep it or not. I'm able to make those kinds of decisions in this debate. That means then that the claims that we get from OO here are just simply not very reasonable. The first sort of idea that we get from OO is that this is just a super vague principled notion, that it's not about what happens in the real world. We're not granting anyone rights off this. No, because belonging is actionable. If you have ownership of something, if something is yours, then you're able to make decisions about it. The other claim from OO is that, well, this is like you still have a responsibility to do this. Like fathers sometimes have to pay child support. But the thing here is we've shown to you that belonging is about positive rights and being able to do things, not negative obligations that you place on people. Child support is a negative obligation. It's something that you have to do. It doesn't show that you have a right of ownership or or that the child belongs to you and you're able to decide things like how they go to school or how they live their lives and so on. Before I move on to the second extension, does CO have anything?
I'm going to ask you the same thing I asked OG. If I have an organ and I give it to you for safekeeping, is that something that I own or is it something that I don't own?
I have possession of that organ, you still own that organ, but if for whatever reason, maybe accident, a hospital takes it or something, this organ ends up in someone else, I think your ownership ceases at that point. More explanation of this in bodily autonomy. Second extension, then, we're going to explain bodily autonomy, because I think OG is extremely brief on this. We get about one line from PM that says, if something is inside you, then it belongs to you. But there's lots of questions here, like, why do we grant bodily autonomy in the first place? Why do we prioritize this in relation to all of the other rights in this debate? What is the significance of an accident? And why is still bodily autonomy something that we care about in those sorts of situations? Let's answer these questions. Firstly, why do we value bodily autonomy? I think there's a couple of reasons here. The first thing is to say that your body is your most intimate aspect of yourself, right? It is literally who you are, and it defines those kinds of things. Secondly, I think in many cases, you are just literally your body. Without your body, you wouldn't be alive, you wouldn't be on Earth, you wouldn't be a moral actor, you wouldn't be able to experience anything. So if we take away people's bodily autonomy, then we're taking away literally what makes them themselves and their ability to act in those kinds of ways. But thirdly, I think instrumentally, bodily autonomy is something that is necessary for order for individuals to experience all sorts of rights and benefits. If you're not able to be in good health and have control of your body, you're not able to move around, exercise other rights within society, or obtain practical benefits. And importantly, I would note that bodily autonomy is something that we prioritize or triumphs over other things like the accidental nature of this. And I would just put to you a thought experiment. Imagine you go to a hospital and by some accident, someone else's organ, maybe one that CO gave to the hospital for safekeeping, accidentally ends up inside you because of nothing other than the accident or fault of the hospital. I think in these sorts of cases, the hospital clearly has no right to just take that organ out of you because it has now entered into your body. You now have that right of bodily autonomy, even though what gave rise to that was an accidental fact and nature. I think this is the most compelling analogy in this debate because it explains precisely why bodily autonomy still exists in the case of accidents and still exists in the case of like weird thought experiments that CO is coming up with here. What is the significance of this analysis to this round? I think this gives you the most clear explanation of what the principles are in this round, because OG gives us some stuff about arbitrariness, but I'm just not entirely sure why arbitrariness is what individuals are thinking about or what societies are thinking about when they construct social norms and principles that we abide by. I also just think that oftentimes arbitrariness can give rise to moral obligations. The fact that you are the child of your parents and not someone else is kind of random in nature, but we still think that there are special moral obligations there. Which means then that the rest of OG material that is still contributed in this round is things like maybe you are aware that there could have been an accident in the first place. I think this is significantly less strong than the comprehensive explanations that we do provide to you about why bodily autonomy is the primary right that we consider in this round, and it is something that exists despite the accidental nature that other people might be pointing to. Before I move on, OO.
If possession and ownership is the same, other than the fact that you violate parent B's bodily autonomy, would you on your side then be morally okay with things like theft, kidnapping, etc., and you taking over ownership of other people's things?
Possession and ownership are not the same. The only claim that we put forward in this round is that if something is inside your body, then you ought to have ownership over it. So in the specific case of things inside your body, possession and ownership are the same, right? Like you don't give someone an organ transplant and say, actually you only possess this organ, and now someone else still owns it. That doesn't make sense. The only claim that we put forward from closing government is incredibly clear, which is that as soon as something enters your body, regardless of the origin of it, whether it's an accident, the right to bodily autonomy triumphs and you have ownership over it. Final extension then on the nature of rights themselves and how this leads to some really weird outcomes. I would note that the vast majority of rights and the vast majority of cases are instrumental. We come up with certain moral principles because we think they are desirable ways to govern our society and that they lead to the right sorts of things that happen. And I would note here to say that this embryo belongs to the other woman who's the genetic parent and not the one who is owning it leads to some incredibly perverse outcomes. The first of these is that they're just able to order you to carry this embryo or order you to not carry your embryo, which is very clearly wrong. But also, as we POI to open opposition, it means that you're able to do things like kidnap the child in order to exercise your belonging and ownership in those kinds of situations. I think this illustrates very intuitively why this cannot be the right principle or the right calculation in this situation, because it leads to these very perverse outcomes that are very clearly wrong in this kind of situation, and therefore that's not the case. I think at the end of this debate, we explain to you the nature of principles and why bodily autonomy is the one that we prioritize above all else. Vote for closing government.
I'd like to thank the speaker for the fine speech. I'd now like to invite the MO.
Hi, am I clearly audible?
Yes, you are.
All right. I'll take at least one POI from opening government. This is a very tough room, so I'm just going to thank Josh because exceptionally fun partner. Really enjoyed this tournament, and if this is my final speech, it's fine because I just think I had a lot of fun. So thanks a lot, Josh. Also, everyone in the room is my friend, so happy even if I drop. Okay. But yeah, I'm not going to drop, to be clear. I'm not setting myself up to lose. Starting my speech now. Humans don't really define property by themselves. Humans don't define morality by themselves. We can't actually give anyone absolute right over anything. And I think it's really important to understand the analogy here. If I claim to someone that I will work for you for 3 weeks, and then I choose not to work for that person for 3 weeks, I have a right to my body and I can choose not to work for them. But the issue is that person still owns that labor and as a result can absolutely force me to do that work, or at the very least be repaired in a way that they see fit. And that's because they owned the work because I gave it to them. This is important clarifications because the absolute right to your body is quite weird because the implications of it are that we can't really do anything in society. We can't sell our labor, but also at any point, if I just ate your food, sure, you can't take it out of me, but I don't owe you anything in return for it. And I think the case from CO is very simple. This is deception. You entered a contract, you were promised something, and you got deceived. Both the mother, who people call parent B, relaxed dead, and also the person who's carrying the embryo, which people call parent. Both of you were deceived. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is explain why we're unique from opening opposition, because Ted seems to think we're derivative. First thing I want to point out is all of the things they say that are completely unanalyzed because they're circular. The first thing they say is that it is a prerequisite, and as a result, you own it, except their reasoning for why that prerequisite matters is that it is a prerequisite, which is not an argument. Then they say that you have a reciprocal obligation because you did it, and then you were having that person taken away from you, and now that property right is violated. Again, this is circular. This assumes that your property right existed in a way that overwhelmed any other obligations. These are also circular claims. The main claim from them is that the issue here is that the parents put more work in, and second of all, that the shit belongs to Ted, because even if something comes out of you, the reciprocal obligation is that it comes to you. The first claim on how this is about more effort, I think is very uncertain, as OG points out. The part of pregnancy is pretty damn clear on biology. And I think on that, it's really difficult to call the top half on that clash, especially since I think there is a lot of weighing on OG that doesn't involve talking about your shit. But I also think that not that many people think that Ted owns that shit because it's out of his body. And this needs to respond to all of PM's stuff about how actually you don't own things that are out of your body. So I just don't think that OO is doing much here at all. I think the real question here is the one thing Kira says for like 10 seconds and doesn't explain it, which is that intention to create it. Let's explain what this intention is. First of all, when you intend to create it, you are intentionally saying to the organization or the medical body that I want this back in my body once I've put it into the tube. And as a result, maybe it was a mistake. The motion doesn't say it, by the way. I want to make that clear. Maybe it was a mistake and it got put in a different woman's body. The question then is, does that woman have a higher claim than you? Let's explain why that intention matters more than the labor on opening government. The problem is that the government labor was not intentional because the woman was laboring for it, assuming it was her